Guess you feel you'll always be.
Bioshock is a game many regard as a classic, referred to as a cultural landmark in the industry, ultimately being held up as one of the defining pieces for the virtues of video game storytelling. Like my MGS review, Bioshock is one of the few games where the lead creator, in this case Ken Levine, can be looked upon as the driving force for every creative decision. So, without further ado, let's begin.
You were born to do great things. You know what? They were right.
Bioshock plays from a first-person perspective. Surprisingly enough, the player takes control of a named character called Jack, whose plane crashes over the Atlantic Ocean. The game has a strong opening, with the burning embers from the plane and the debris of the passengers' belongings on the ocean surface. Bizarrely, your character narrates the opening line, yet he never speaks again throughout the entire game. The silent protagonist is even more odd if we were to skip to the end of the story and consider Jack's role in the narrative, as he is the linchpin that the entire plot is built around, which makes it very odd that he suddenly speaks and then silent through the rest of it. This is kinda explained away later by the meta-narrative that the game has going for it, which I'll get to, but for now it's one of the many oddities and there's many more to come. You swim towards the convenient lighthouse. We then get the first image of the godlike figure of Andrew Ryan, who looks down upon us, before descending down into the ocean, with the words plastered above, "No gods, or kings, only man." While we descend into the depths to the underwater city of Rapture, Andrew Ryan explains the ideology behind it. Ryan, and as such, his underwater utopia Rapture, is built around the philosophical system of objectivism, proposed by the writer Ayn Rand. And as always, you'll have to forgive my pronunciation.
I am Andrew Ryan, and I'm here to ask you a question. Is a man not entitled to the sweat of his brow?
If you don't know what objectivism is, I wouldn't worry about it, as Ryan's introductory video does a great job of explaining it by showing what it rejected at the time, with just playing through the story, putting into practice a lot of the core ideas behind it. Thankfully, the game never uses the objectivism label as a descriptor, so it never gets bogged down in theoretical mumbo jumbo. And since the game doesn't, I won't either. Ryan believes the individual is king. That's all you need to know. Everything is just a byproduct of that. If the matching initials, and the fact that Andrew Ryan is almost an anagram of Ayn Rand, if this wasn't enough of a giveaway to where the game takes its inspiration from, one of Ayn Rand's books that reflected this notion of objectivism was called Atlas Shrugged, who's a character we're just about to run into. Apart from glancing out the various windows, you never really get to see Rapture from the exterior. So, I'm glad this opening sequence gives us a great view from the outside, hinting at some of the areas we'll be visiting, making a very memorable moment, while being descended on by a splicer that just cut a man into pieces in a scripted sequence. A plucky fellow countryman, Atlas, asks us to pick up a radio and kindly find a weapon. The goal is more or less to escape from here on out. Atlas is your guide throughout the game, needing the player's help on the search for his family. Anyway, we use the nearby wrench to defeat some splicers with the very simple melee combat, before being introduced to the plasmids, which knocks the player out here. The game kinda spoils the introduction of the big daddy and little sister here, which is a shame because the sequence later is a much better reveal. It tells us the little sisters collect Adam from dead splicers and the big daddies protects them, but since the big daddy is on the cover art and nearly all of the marketing material, I'm not going to complain about it. Adam is a monkey paw style substance in the game. Using Adam, referred to as splicing, allows the user to rewrite their own genetic code, often turning them into drug-fueled maniacs in the process, called splicers, which is the main enemy type for the player. Adam is also what was used to create the plasmids that the player uses throughout the game. The first being given here, electricity, which, as you can imagine, allows you to stun enemies and electrify any wet surface, but you're limited to the amount you can use by the blue meter under your health bar, and the player will have to use Eve to replenish it. This stimming yourself animation will get you killed numerous times. You can cancel out of it by switching to your weapon, but even still, that's enough time for the game to kill you. At any rate, the game greatly encourages you to use your weapons and powers together to be more effective in combat.
Do
punch. Remember, the 1-2 punch.
Switching hands can be a little awkward, but it gets the job done. Some plasmids function as puzzle solutions, so you'll have to find more powers throughout the game, ranging from telekinesis, allowing you to hurl objects at an enemy, or incinerate, letting you set enemies alight. This means they are spaced out early on, as a way to roadblock progression. You need incinerate to allow you to unfreeze doorways for an example, so it's mandatory you get a few of them. All others can be found or bought at the Gatherer's Garden, so there is a certain amount of player freedom here. Many of the powers tend to overlap with each other, either stunning or dealing damage, or a little bit of both, so I'm not going to go through them. Enemies' health increases substantially every new area, meaning plasmids slowly lose their effectiveness as the game progresses. So, by the end, even with the upgrades, stunning the enemy is the only thing that's practical. When we enter the Kashmir restaurant, the world under the Sea of Rapture comes into focus. Atlas is in a power struggle with Ryan, and we're witnessing Rapture after his failed rebellion. You're now exploring what's left of the decaying city. Bioshock plays through a variety of locations in Rapture that you can consider levels. The goal of most every level is often trying to pass some roadblock Ryan has put in front of the player, regularly blocking some sort of access, with Atlas guiding the player on what to do. This is essentially the story for chunks of the game, and the particulars of grabbing a key or turning something back on isn't really important to the overall narrative. This can make it sound like the story's main focus is to have the player doing a lot of busy work, and it is. However, the meat of the story is delivered both through the environment and the audio diary scattered around. This is the main reason why Atlas and Ryan has the player running around everywhere, as the objectives are only really there to get you to explore the world. So the story can be delivered this way, which is a good thing as the levels are engaging and fun to explore. That's what the moment to moment gameplay is like. A lot of looking around the environment, searching for resources, such as ammo and medkits, or finding key items and listening to audio diaries, with combat encounters every few moments or so. This is why the compass that points you to your current objective can be a bit much. It works and is nice to have, except it gets confused easily, and the environments never really reach that scale or complexity to warrant it. The other reason, which is more important, it overlaps with the map, and while using the compass doesn't interrupt gameplay, like opening the map does, many players will be using the map all too often, just to make sure they've explored everything, or to find the nearest vending machine and what have you, which tends to defeat its usefulness anyway. The environments by today's standards could benefit from more little details. Don't get me wrong, games both old and new tend to stick a long-winded note down in a very barren area, and have the nerve to call it environmental storytelling. So what's there in Bioshock is well done. For example, when you first enter Rapture, we see the amount of suitcases stacked on top of each other, showing how desperate people were to leave at the end, not to mention having to pay to enter a bathroom stall, which is a great little detail to illustrate Ryan's outlook on free market capitalism. The fact that you buy ammo and superpowered plasmids through generic talking vending machines really paint what type of world Rapture is. The early section is very linear, and it's there to give a stable footing for the player. It introduces the melee combat, shooting, and the plasmids. We understand the story of this world will come through the audio diaries. Finally, Andrew Ryan is presented as the paranoid tyrant antagonist. This gets across the three mysteries of Rapture almost immediately. What has happened, how did it happen, and why has it happened? That's why the audio diaries are so important. Since we never get to experience Rapture's rise and fall firsthand, the audio diaries come with that great nuance of always giving us a subjective viewpoint of the events. You have them and what you can glean from the environment to piece things together. So there's always some details left unanswered, but the big picture is always very clear. There's also visions of ghosts you get throughout the game. It's something to do with the memories contained in Adam. It's a leap in logic for me, and for what they offer, I think they probably should have been cut from the game. In my personal opinion, a game nowadays has about 20 minutes, possibly in the past the first hour, to hook the player and get its core ideas across. Otherwise, I think most players tend to drop off. Bioshock is as solid as an opening as one could achieve, and it only takes about 20 minutes. The first real level is the medical pavilion, this introducing the so-called boss of the area, Steinman, a plastic surgeon whose use of Adam has drove him crazy. This is a pattern the game falls into, every level introducing a boss or a character that often reflects their environment in some way. These are often the people that make up Rapture's industry elites, with Ryan as the head of it all. These bosses and the environments being the standout feature of the game. In terms of graphics, a game from 2007 is going to show its age, but for the most part it still holds up. A strong art style has helped the game age tremendously, with the stark lighting and bold use of colour in parts helping gloss over some of its shortcomings. And the fire effects, for example, still impress to this day. The game's sound design is fantastic, from the sounds of the vending machines, to the creaking of Rapture herself, to the rackets the big daddies and little sisters makes, down to the splicers arguing with each other, rounded out by a low-key musical score that really lets these sound effects breathe. It's all top-notch stuff. The voice acting in particular is across the board some of the best. Now, some of the villains can lean into cartoon territory at times, but overall it's brilliant.
Oh, shimmering like a scalpel. Steinman, she calls. Steinman, I have what you're looking for. Just open your eyes, and when I see her, she cuts me into 1,000 beautiful pieces.
The level design greatly benefits from the lack of it in parts. That is to say, maps are designed to be genuine for the buildings and locations they're meant to represent, not crafted to be levels in a first-person shooter. Obviously there's some serious leeway here. It would be easy to point out that an underwater city would not be as inefficient with its space. Even so, the more cramped level design means encounters are more in your face, and the environments come with an aura of a believable place. The game is a triumph in art design, art deco and architecture. Just the overall aesthetics of the game is worthy of praise. It's in my opinion the game's most valuable asset, and makes it worth playing despite its many shortcomings. It's so well done, it even helps ground some of the fantastical stuff in the narrative. Take the plasmids that grant superpowers. These are presented in these very real world advertisements for the time, which lends a credibility to something that would be otherwise far-fetched. The fact that the telekinesis plasmid can't stop bullets because people's reaction times are too slow. It's these little touches that help greatly when something as magical as being able to shoot fire is presented as a tonic you can buy over the counter at your local store. It definitely helps ground it more in reality. And the location of Rapture itself, although fantastical, it suffers from many of the real world problems an underwater city would likely have, such as leaking pipes, generating electricity, producing oxygen and the like. And in order to achieve Ryan's utopia without outside interference, under the ocean is the only conceivable place for it, which Ryan himself points out. Maybe the moon, but with it being underwater, we're already stretching here as is. Combine this with the ethics of Andrew Ryan, whose great chain of industry is defined only by its need to turn a profit, without the needs for regulations or principles. It's not hard to see how technology and science could advance more rapidly than on the surface. Despite my nitpicks, Rapture as a fictional place is the hook that Ken Levine can lay his hat on at the end of the day and feel proud. But enough praise. The game suffers from a lot of minor gameplay annoyances that tends to pile up on top of each other very quickly. For example, this area introduces the hacking mechanic. You're allowed to hack things such as the vending machines, cameras and turrets, which is definitely a good idea and adds more layers to the gameplay. However, to do this, you need to complete a mini-game, where you direct the flow of water from one pipe to another, in a jigsaw style of fashion, as you reveal and insert the corresponding piece to complete the chain. Before I complain, to be fair to Bioshock, I've never played a hacking minigame I've actually liked, and this pipe one is easy to understand and get the hang of quickly, but heavens above, who thought in their right mind this was a good idea to have in a superpowered shooter? To start, it's kinda crazy the game got put out with only one type of minigame. Come on guys, if you're gonna make me play a tedious minigame, at least make it multiple tedious minigames, to at least help avoid burnout, as this pipe game takes too long and gets old fast. The fact that it pauses the game mid-action to perform a very menial task wasn't bad enough. It just flat out isn't enjoyable or interesting. To the game's mercy, I will say paying to skip the hack or using the auto hack tool is a great feature, not just because it avoids the minigame. Later, machines want a big chunk of change, and without some of the hacking tonics, you'll be in a real bind, adding to the feeling of player choice matters. Now, paying a bot to work for you arguably doesn't make much logical sense, but it's very in keeping with the world. The place is so greedy, you can literally bribe the machines. The biggest issue, and the most obvious one, is how is directing water through pipes hacking a machine? It doesn't even make sense on the most basic levels of understanding, and feels tacked on for variety's sake. All you have to do is change the water to an electric current, and the pipes to switches, and there you go. That's why I'm surprised the game released with this as is. Like, imagine if you ran out of ammo at some point, and had no money, so you could only damage the enemies by using the hacked machines. The nightmare-inducing task of playing countless rounds of this minigame in order to proceed is literally giving me shivers thinking about it. The game compounds these issues, because with all that said, I actually don't think the hacked machines are much help, if any at all. The turrets might terminate you in seconds, but when hacked, they are weak in both damage output and in taking it. I find the security bots just get in your way than actually hit the enemy. The only helpful part of both is they distract the enemies for you, or at the very least let you know that an enemy is nearby. After running around for a while, we finally encounter Steinman. I call these characters the level's bosses, although I think I was being far too generous with the term boss, because despite the game's levels doing a great job building a lot of these characters up, and the unique places you find them in, the actual encounters are disappointing, as they all just equate to a slightly tougher Splicer encounter. And it's disappointing because it wouldn't have taken much to make each encounter feel unique. Shortly after this, we find a destroyed Big Daddy and run into Tenenbaum. This presents the game's morality system. You can either choose to save the little sisters at the cost of Adam, or harvest them for more of the substance. Essentially, it's how much use you get out of the Gatherer's Garden, the game's upgrade system. On one hand, Tenenbaum asks you to save them. Sounds good. Except, she's the very reasons the little sisters exist in the first place. So how good could she actually be? On the other, harvesting them kills the girl. Sounds bad. Except, it nets us more Adam, and as Atlas rightly points out, they're monsters anyway. So maybe we're doing them a mercy. I made it sound much more interesting than it actually is. There's no nuance to this system whatsoever. It's binary, and the entire thing is riddled with holes. It's one of those systems where you make one or two bad decisions, you're considered evil forever. The morality of it all is built on Bioshock's upgrade system. So, fundamentally, choosing the moral good route should make the game harder, coming from the fact that you can afford less upgrades and vice versa if you choose the bad route, which in turn making the game easier. Except, after you save 3 little sisters, you're rewarded with gifts that contain tonics and items. Oh, and also Adam, the very penalty the moral player should be suffering without, undermining the moral choice entirely. The most egregious aspect is that nothing ever interesting comes from it. Nothing really changes throughout the game. Tenenbaum and the little sisters still help you, just a line of dialogue here and there. The main change is in the ending, but I found both conclusions to be very plain anyway. Maybe after you kill enough little sisters, the big daddies will be hostile instantly, or vice versa, and will help the player if you save enough of them. I'm not saying it's a great idea, but it would definitely add more layers to the morality system, and would have been easy to program in. Speaking of which, after this we encounter our first fightable Big Daddy. These are the game's claim to fame, so to speak. The Big Daddies are something the player chooses to engage, as they roam freely around any given area, and are non-hostile until the player engages first. At this point, we have a few upgrades and some new weapons to take him down. So now, we might as well talk about the combat. The game is a first-person shooter. Well, in that same sense that something like Fallout 3, or New Vegas is an FPS as well. If the game only had its gunplay propping it up, it would fail miserably. Thankfully it doesn't. It has the addition of superpowers and the tonics to spice things up. The tonics equate to passive buffs for the player. They range drastically in effects, meaning many are useless when compared to others, so overall it's a flawed system. Still, they're a nice feature. I wouldn't go as far as to say they allow for player builds in the game, but they certainly allow the player to lean more heavily into one mechanic than another, such as the hacking or shooting. The fact that you can never truly specialise in any one thing perhaps comes with an unintended benefit. The player will need every tool at their disposal in order to survive at some point, and if I squint my eyes, maybe one could say it plays into the meta narrative. I praised the sound design earlier. Well, That was with an omission to the gun sound effects. Arguably the one thing Bioshock should have got right in its sound design. All guns just fall flat in both their sound and their feel, maybe with exception to the crossbow. The one-time upgrade stations can help alleviate this problem a little, but every gun lacks the so-called punch they require to feel good. A lot of this has to do with the animations, as well as the sound design. Animations are weak across the board, from the shooting to the painfully slow reloads and how the enemies move. The big daddies and little sisters fare a little better here, but overall it lacks nuance, and enemies' movements and attacks feel very floaty. I hesitate to use the word, but it feels amateurish. Once again, little problems tend to stack on top of each other. When it comes to combat, the game suffers from small delays in nearly everything. To start, the shooting. The machine gun has a delay before the gun starts firing. All the guns have issues with damage registering. From the time it takes to register a bullet hitting an enemy, them losing actual health, it's all delayed. Pressing the trigger to actually firing the plasmid has a delay due to the animations involved. There's a delay on enemies from getting hit to then being stunned. There's even a delay on enemies actually dying when their health is 0, which often means they get one last cheap hit in and you waste resources. Now, I can't prove this, but I think the hit detection is off overall with all of the weapons, or at the very least the gun's crosshair isn't as accurate as the game lets on. Add on to the fact you need to reload your weapon every time you want to change ammo type, which is realistic to an extent sure, painful to do amidst a firefight. And we end up with a combat system that seems to be constantly getting in the way of the player's enjoyment. With the Big Daddy down, we move on to Neptune's bounty. It's notable for 2 reasons. The mentions of Fontaine, a smuggler and racketeering gangster who Ryan eventually brought down, yet despite being presumably dead, manages to make the denizens of Rapture quiver. The other is the introduction of the camera, allowing you to snap pictures of the enemies. Yeah, it's Bioshock Snap. You gotta catch 'em all.
At least 150 or more to see. To be a Pokemon master is my destiny.
It's almost like another minigame. Taking pictures increases a meter to each enemy type in the game, that when full, can unlock tonics, upgrades, and damage buffs with every tier to the corresponding enemy. What sort of logical sense this makes, I couldn't tell you. Although, it's incredibly useful, and yet far too abusable. One being, it uses film as ammo, which is incredibly cheap to buy, meaning you can spam the camera until the score gets too low. This can turn the game's difficulty curve upside down for a while, and when maxed out on the torrents and bots, allow for an instant hack. But hey, I ain't complaining. The camera asks you to forgo your weapons, putting yourself at major risk, but it's an idea that looks better on paper than in practice, and that's due to the enemy's AI. So how does that fare? Fighting with the enemies throughout the game is often dynamic or unscripted. Enemies will have to notice the player, often before they engage, and most famously the Big Daddies are passive until the player strikes first, which presents a lot of player freedom. Obviously the splicers will fight your hacked machines, but more impressive, they'll also fight with each other, and sort of band together to take on the Big Daddies. It's even possible to get non-hostile Big Daddies to fight the splicers and hostile machines for you, as the Big Daddy AI is programmed to attack the first thing that hits it, so using the Big Daddy as a passive shield to trigger it against splicers and machines is a valid strategy. With this quirk, I often got 2 Big Daddies to fight each other while I sat back and watched. This isn't me being creative, it's designed in a way to give the player the option to make the different systems play off each other, with certain plasmids encouraging the player to take advantage of this system. All this makes enemy encounters sound impressive, and in some small ways it is. Overall though, the enemy AI is weak. Once again, and I know I'm sounding like a broken record at this stage, but it's because of a lot of the little annoyances. Enemies don't take cover and will often swarm and just rush the player. The odd splicer will strafe from side to side, but it's nothing special, and in most cramped environments, they can't perform it very well. The bright muzzle flash from the enemy's guns blinds you and makes them hard to hit. The bouncer Big Daddy makes this annoying roar that slows you down to walking on quicksand, with no explanation, and often makes them cheaply hit you. With them dashing around everywhere, they have this huge tendency to get stuck in the environment. Speaking of environment, the enemies never make any use of it, in the same way the player can. I've never seen them electrify anything or light anything on fire. Nothing was ever hurled at me with telekinesis. Spider splicers will crawl along the ceiling, and Houdini splicers will cast fireballs. And the odd time I've seen an enemy use a health station, but it's in no way enough. You can argue all this away by saying everyone in Rapture is insane, so they're not exactly going to be clever in their attacks, but I think that would be a poor argument at best. Well, at least the game has a few survival horror elements going for it, like resource gathering and a challenging gameplay. Well, this is why the Vita-chambers are a bit of a strange one for me. They're Bioshock's own brand of checkpoints. At that, they resurrect the player at the nearest one with no penalty whatsoever. There is no limit to their use, and enemies in the area don't revive or regain health. Granted, that would create a whole new set of problems. To start, from a narrative perspective, I think they might be a step too far. Look, I know this is a world that takes place in an underwater city, where superpowers are the norm, or with only 1950s know-how. Even still, a device that can bring you back to life instantly just seems a step too far into absurdity. It hasn't got some of those grounded elements that make the other fictional things, such as the plasmids, have going for it. Regardless of that, from a gameplay perspective, I'm also torn. If I was being kind, they could be considered quick saves that most players would use anyway, except you have the added benefit that you don't have to wait through a load screen after you die. So in that sense, they eliminate some players constantly saving after every splicer battle or Big Daddy fight. The whole quick save mentality, where people will reload the save the minute something goes wrong. This eliminates that, because in essence, the Vita-chambers do it for you. Look, I understand after a botched encounter, no one wants to be booted back to the main menu, or constantly be waiting in loading screens for the game to resume. There's something to be said about how the Vita-chambers keeps the player's flow going, without interruptions from the game itself. I guess you do lose some time in Bioshock, as you have to backtrack to where you were from the Vita-chamber, but we're talking 10 seconds at the absolute most, if that, which by today's standards is a fairly brief load time, except in Bioshock at least you're playing the game, not watching a loading screen. So far, I've made a really great case for the Vita-chambers. So what's the problem then? Well, therein lies the issue, the sheer lack of a problem. Players have nothing at stake or to worry about. With exception to the final boss, everything in the game can be beaten by sheer attrition, and your wrench means, even if you run out of ammo, you can still whittle down an enemy's health bar, sucking the entire challenge out of the game, because no matter how bad you are, or how much you screw up, you will always win the fight. Look, it's not like I'm a fan of replaying sections over and over again, but I'd argue that's what difficulty systems in games was made to circumvent. You can't play a video game unless you stand to lose at that game. To be put simply, there has to be consequences. It doesn't have to be a complete fail state or anything, but at the very least, you should lose something in the process of failing, such as experience, money, and so on and so forth. Even time itself can be considered a commodity you stand to lose. When did you last save, or when was your last checkpoint? Now, if you should fail, you'll have to replay that part of the game, costing yourself time. This is surprisingly enough for the player to take what is happening seriously. Bioshock doesn't even have that going for it, as the backtracking only takes a few seconds and enemies don't respawn. The key point is that there's no punishment for dying, and because you can't truly die, you can't lose. And because you can't lose, gathering resources is redundant, because why gather ammo and health packs to survive when surviving is a given? Bioshock is built around the player scavenging resources, and in turn by doing so, they'll find the audio diaries, which is how Bioshock tells its story. So the Vita-chambers run in opposition to how the game wants to present its narrative, and if it wasn't for the final boss, you probably wouldn't even need to upgrade your weapons, or gather items at all to succeed. I could just keep going on and on here. The whole game begins to unravel at the seams by this inferior checkpoint system. I only think Bioshock gets away with it because it's so ingrained in players not to die. So, it's the player's own pride that makes them survive as long as possible. I know I'm getting caught up here in a small part of the game, but being able to succeed and fail essentially makes a game, well, a game. At any rate, they can be turned off in the options, so you can argue it's a moot point at this stage, since they're optional. But this wasn't patched in till later, and it's clear the game was designed with them as an integral part of the game. That's all our bases covered for the moment. Now the game kinda falls into a rhythm and we move along at a fairly consistent pace. We fight another boss, except it's just plasmids and wrench, the only neat twist the game does for a boss fight. Next we watch Atlas's family get blown to smithereens by Ryan. Then we start a fairly lengthy task to keep the oxygen on in Rapture, which spans 2 whole areas as we travel between the market and Arcadia collecting items. So, at least from a player's objective standpoint, the game was starting to run thin on interesting stuff for the player to do, as the narrative ante continues to go up every area, and in doing so, everything is presented as a race to get done as quickly as possible. Atlas can only say you need to hurry so many times. The story was starting to suffer from prolonged exposure to itself, and so the whole thing was starting to become drawn out and beginning to undermine itself. There's only a certain amount of hoops you can have the player jump through before they start asking, why am I jumping around everywhere?
What are you waiting for? Hit the damn switch!
This was the feeling I had finishing up Arcadia, so even the introduction of Frolic and where it's placed in the game is downright perfect. With communication cut off from Ryan and Atlas, the game's pace immediately slows down, and both Sander Cohen's introduction, environment, voice and demeanour creates an entirely different tone from the rest of the game. It's in such stark contrast, and its plot is entirely self-contained, it's almost to the point where it feels like a DLC that a modern game would try to sell you down the line. Up to now, the game has always had some horror elements going for it, but this was the only part in the game where I was actually disturbed by anything, and it comes in the form of one of Cohen's audio tapes.
The Wild Bunny by Sander Cohen. I want to take the ears off, but I can't. I hop, and when I hop, I never get off the ground. It's my curse, my eternal curse. I want to take the ears off, but I can't. It's my curse. It's my fucking curse. I want to take the ears off. Please, take them off. Please.
It's hard to know whether Cohen was made crazy like everyone else by Adam, or he put everything he had into his art and lost his mind in the process. As such, he's one of the only personalities in the game that rivals the magnetism of Ryan. Taking pictures for Cohen's art piece can be a bit meh on the surface, but going around hunting down his former students and allies makes it way more interesting than it has any right to be. Once again, it's the area and the boss being the standout here. Cohen gives you gifts, launches an ambush against you to waltz the flowers, scorns and teases you throughout. Finally, he presents himself to an adoring audience that isn't there, and leaves you a parting gift, which gives you the option to fight him, although he's non-hostile, and he's just a tougher Houdini splicer. By the time Atlas talks to you again, your mind will be scrambled by what just happened before. He's so unlike the other deranged people, it's no wonder many consider him and the area the standout level of the game. Next we are trying to find a way to break into Ryan's domain, and although I have to admit this area grinds on me, with building a bomb equating to more busy work as you search and collect more items, the new environment, matched with what happened after Fort Frolic, the game undeniably needed some time to get things back on track before the big reveal with Ryan. So now we get to talk about the elephant in the room, with no restraint on spoilers from here on out. Ryan rightly points out how much of a coincidence it is that your plane crashed on top of Rapture.
That crash lands on the same city in the middle of the ocean. Why, that sounds more like a miracle.
Then we find tapes stating that the Vita-chambers could only be used by people with Ryan's genetic code. And before again, the biospheres we've been using to travel around should only work with Ryan. Like any good twist, it puts the answers right in front of you from the very beginning. Then we land in the room with the famous words, "Would you kindly?" written on a board with the pictures of all the key players involved. Turns out, you've been a sleeper agent for Atlas this whole time. Jack was born in Rapture, and genetically created from Ryan's DNA, hence why the Vita-chambers and biospheres worked for you. Ryan then begins controlling you with the key phrase, "Would you kindly?" Exposes how you've been a slave this whole time, as you've been secretly controlled and led down a predetermined path this whole time. Essentially, you're a puppet. In the most famous scene in the game, Ryan then uses you to have him kill himself with a golf club. Then we hand control of Rapture to Atlas, who turns out to be Fontaine, who's been doing this whole Kaiser Soze long con, after which we are saved by the little sisters. Now, let's stop for a moment and talk about the twist. To start, the build up and reveal makes this an incredibly unforgettable moment. It's the very reason this game is considered a cultural landmark. However, I do think the narrative cheats here and there. One being there's no relevance to your character until you find yourself in the Would You Kindly room, where suddenly Jack is the most important character in the game. You can't treat your protagonist like a nobody in the story, then make him a somebody, and then act as if you fooled everyone. Atlas is another issue. Nearly every character in the game has a flimsy code of ethics. So, Atlas tricking us into thinking he's the last decent person in Rapture doesn't hold up as well as the game thinks. Although you could chalk that up to me talking about it now in retrospect. The better example is when you meet him for the first time. Why is Atlas keeping up the charade to fool you, and presumably Ryan, if we're under his control? Clearly the mind control is working, because you've crashed the plane and shown up in Rapture. So why is Atlas claiming to have a fake family, and the many more questions that creates? It's all never explained. Still, it's possible I've missed something, so I can look past these and just take the twist for what it is. I will give the game this. For what ideas it does have, it at least presents it with confidence. Being Ryan's son, I can appreciate as a way to bring the player into the world, to make them feel a part of it in some way. It's at the very least a noble idea, even if I'm not a huge fan of it. And although a fight with him would have been neat, in hindsight it was the right decision. Ryan was a man of unwavering convictions, a villain of ideological principles and control, not a fighter. So him taking the player's control away was probably the best way to make sure he remained true to himself as a character. The whole "you've been controlled this entire time to go down a predestined path" is what I take issue with. Now, while it's a memorable moment with Ryan, I don't think it's that meaningful. While it's praised, it's for its meta commentary on video games itself. The games offer abundance of choices, but are in actuality very limited. And as such, the game has not been about choice. It's been about the lack of choice. Fighting big daddies, roaming around for audio diaries, snapping pictures, purchasing new plasmids and collecting tonics. All can be ignored or be done at your leisure if you want. It sounds liberating. However, more than likely, you need to do these things in order to curtail the difficulty curve. So even when it seems like you have freedom, you often don't. Each player is on a leash being pulled by the developer. The meta-narrative's goal was to point this out, by having Jack experience the same thing, except for a story reason. Both reviewers and players have applauded the story for pointing this out, as if it was a revelation, when really any person who plays video games from time to time could have told you this. Depending on what game, we all understand there's a limit to the choice the player can make. However, Bioshock presents it in this very disingenuous way, like most games are in some way tricking or lying to the players. Like Atlas has done to Jack. Choices in most games were means to an end. The gameplay might have a lot of freedom in its approach, as a way to engage the player by letting them go about things in their own playstyle. Or have the story in some small ways might shape itself around the player's decisions, as a way to involve them in the narrative. It was not an activity solely unto itself. It was never freedom and choice for the sake of it. And that's exactly what Bioshock is guilty of. Bioshock's main idea was to give the impression the player had freedom and choice. So when they pull the rug from underneath us, we find out that is not the case. It essentially holds up a mirror to itself, pointing out the limitations in the system. It's meta by pointing this out, but to what end? We still go on to play a very linear game, with the same poor design choices. There's no new ideas, nor does it comment on how to fix these issues. So I ask again, to what end? I believe the truth to why the game is designed this way, so it can be seen as a postmodern game, as the story's twist is essentially one big commentary on video games itself. But unlike a lot of postmodern stuff, it does a great job of pointing these flaws out, but does nothing to alleviate them. If anything, it makes the game come off as if it's obsessed with itself, like the game is desperate to be seen as some highbrow piece of art. The truth is, the game has the audacity to copy every design convention in the book, implements them poorly, and just by pointing all of this stuff out, demands respect as a piece of intellectual media, and I don't buy it. If anything, the meta-narrative kind of backfires, as it robs most players of that visceral feeling they've achieved something. You could argue that's a shallow feeling, because completing a game doesn't really achieve anything. But even Bioshock, a game that went out of its way to illustrate the meaninglessness of choices in games, has multiple endings, that guess what, reflect the moral choice you've been making throughout the game. It all comes off as one giant contradiction. Bioshock's biggest problem now, and moving into the future, is simple, is the game itself. The best way to illustrate this is to talk about another postmodern game. Metal Gear Solid 2 does a lot of postmodern stuff as well, arguably to much greater success. But even if we were to cut all that stuff out, we still have a well designed game with satisfying mechanics in its gameplay, and therein lies the big difference. Cut the postmodern stuff from Bioshock, and we have poor design choices at every step. A somewhat interesting world with mediocre gameplay. Bioshock manages to take a bunch of different elements from various sources and carve a great identity for itself. But by putting a huge focus on this meta-narrative, that sole purpose is to undermine everything you do for the sake of art, manages to, in one smooth motion, trample all over its great identity. But that's enough of my huffing and puffing. Thankfully, the game continues down its path of its commentary on the failings of objectivism. The game is much more of a success in this aspect, thanks to the variety you can have in your playstyle and how unscripted the encounters can be. The game avoids tedium for a while. Probably sometime after the halfway point, the repetition kicks in hard. Enemies gain huge amounts of health, guns and plasmids are less effective, and the levels begin to fall a bit flat. And the story after Ryan's death becomes surprisingly formulaic. Ryan is replaced with a cartoon goon in Fontaine, who comes off like some sort of bad Joker henchman. Fontaine, in my opinion, should have never lost his Atlas persona, even when he was outed. He also should have never been as forthcoming with his goals to rule Rapture and then the outside world. So he maintains a certain mystery and mystique. We're now in about the last quarter of the game, and I'm not going to go into much detail on it because it's all very samey. The last few levels are more fetch quests, and they're very grind heavy. Lots of juiced up splices and big daddies and turrets. And despite all the upgrades, the gunplay feels even weaker than before. Plasmids now seriously lack in damage output, leading to a lot of drawn out encounters. It's not hard or anything, it's just tedious. The game could do with more enemy types, probably one more big daddy, and maybe 2 more splicer variants. The different splicers also suffer from a lack of clarity. Now there is a grotesque design to nearly everything in the game. So much so when you heal the little sisters, they still look sort of ugly. So naturally you expect the different splices to be equally horrific. Still, the different variants do require different approaches from the player, and you often can't tell which is which until it's too late. A stronger contrast in design would have helped greatly. One of the final major tasks is that we're charged with becoming a big daddy in order to proceed. Once again, it sounds more interesting than it is. All it boils down to is collecting a series of parts, like we haven't done that enough. You can still see Jack's sweater, despite the fact he's meant to be wearing a diving suit, which is frustrating, with the game's final mission having you escort a slow moving little sister around. What's more funny, or rather sadistic about this, is the obnoxious fisheye lens they have on the screen for the last few sections of the game. It's almost as someone on the development team was trying to make the gameplay more annoying. Thank God for the final boss they remove it. Speaking of which, Frank Fontaine is a character that suffers from that classic video game problem, where the villain uses the player to destroy all his or her enemies, watching you defeat everything in your wake, single-handedly. Despite all this, they have the bright idea that they will be able to defeat you instead. Except in Fontaine's case, he splices up with tons of Adam. Yeah, great idea. I stick to my opinion that Frank is a cartoon character. As is, they probably should have cut him from the game. With that said, I think the idea of the final boss was the right one. They obviously wanted the final boss to be Atlas, famously depicted as a bronze statue, like the one sculpted by Lee Lowry in New York's Rockefeller Center. This piece has been appropriated as a prime symbol of the objectivism movement, and despite how weak the final boss is, it at the very least feels like it destroyed the very symbol of objectivism itself. Ryan was a villain of words and ideology. Having him as a spliced up, 8-foot bronzed Adonis would really ruin him as a character. so Frank is understandable in that sense. He just needed to be a better character. So it works in two ways. With Ryan you destroy the ideology, and with Fontaine you literally destroy the symbol. And with that, objectivism falls. As I've said, this aspect of the story is much stronger, and it's a shame that the focus wasn't all there to begin with, as nothing is as clear as it should be. The game ends with you either saving Rapture or taking over the rest of the world, and I think both are fairly pedestrian endings. So that's Bioshock. It misses the mark as a game with player choice, and as a narrative focusing on choices in games. It tries to justify its own failings by stating it was for the sake of art. I honestly think Bioshock had no idea what it truly wanted to be. I'm not sure if Ken and his team was trying to evolve player choice in games by showing how minor it is in most titles, or they simply forgot how to make interesting player choices in the first place. All these botched design choices say to me that the team could not make hard choices in development. The museum, available in the remaster, seems like a nice treat for fans of the game. However, it practically reads to me as a confession from a development team that had no idea what game they were making, and had no idea what the overall story was intended to be. Walking through this place, it seems to me the designers quickly lost confidence on what was a good idea in the first place. I myself am a little taken aback on how harsh I've been on this game throughout this review. A lot of YouTubers about selling hate or hot takes, often taking beloved pieces of media and knocking them down a peg or two, which is exactly what I've done. Yet, it was never my intention when I started out revisiting this game. Don't get me wrong, if I squint my eyes and tilt my head, I can totally see how this could have been an amazing game. But due to the fact the praise this game has received over the following decade and a half, and how Ken has taken the mediocre ideas from other games and ran with them in the sequels, instead of trying to fix the problems present in the original, I can't look past what a bloated, annoying and frustrating mess this game is, that somehow have been deemed a staple of video game storytelling. Its sequel, Bioshock 2, had little to no involvement from Ken Levine, and this is no exaggeration. It fixes everything the first game failed at, in both story and gameplay. Every big to minor issue I went into great detail about was fixed, reworked or improved in the sequel, and is, with no doubt in my mind, the far superior game in every way. The sequel's only problem is that Bioshock 1 exists, and as such, it might only ever be seen in the shadow of the original. There is a huge power in doing something first. Like Kojima, Ken Levine is a man with countless fantastic ideas, and the games industry are in desperate need of these people, perhaps more than ever. However, letting auteurs run around with unmitigated image of their creativity only leads to disaster. We only have to look at Kojima's and Levine's final game in both retrospective franchises as the prime examples. All creativity needs to be challenged. This has been Jamie on Bioshock, and if you've made it this far into the video, I want to thank you for watching.
Surrender all my love to you.